All right, so some considerations for pursuing fertility control. John kind of opened this discussion with identifying what the specific conflicts are, what the impacts are, and identifying who the stakeholders are. That is basically your core approach to deciding what to do, if anything, whether it's fertility control or, changing road signs or what have you. So any type of intervention, you really need to sit down and take a look at all the aspects of what's happening in your community, what the core complaints are, where they are, all of that stuff. And then assess the need for intervention versus, maybe education and increasing tolerance. For fertility control specifically, you want to definitely make sure that what you're proposing with this tool actually fits the need or the problems themselves. And then, community infrastructure, political support, all of those things we've kind of hammered out quite a bit. So all of that is pretty much your bread and butter of beginning to design your own plan. Funding, a huge component, and then program and project staffing is going to be the issue here moving forward. Who's going to design and implement these types of programs? And that's going to be different for each community. It's going to be different for each group, each type of management plan. So those are all things that that we are, constantly considering, and they're going to be site-specific. Pursuing suitable pathways, so whether it's management versus research. And one of the questions that I commonly get are like, hey, what's the difference? So I've just carved out some of the basics here of the key points that separate these two items. So currently, management programs have a purpose of, directly addressing population dynamics, where a lot of our research programs, specifically, with PZP, we're using those studies to really further explore some of our unanswered questions, test new ideas, look at new technologies. So it's not necessarily geared towards specifically reducing a population. It's more towards helping us refine the tool that we already know is a workable piece of the puzzle. Both need to have clear, measurable goals. The research needs to be in line with community desires if you're going to be a host community. So if the expectation is we'd like to use a research project, but we really want you to manage the deer, that doesn't really fit into the research paradigm. So for those studies where we're still in the research phase, it is really important to know the expectations and then manage those expectations of the community that's kind of outside of your planning committee. And then, the outcomes for research aren't necessarily specific to population level effects. For instance, if you're looking at GPS collaring or what have you, the outcomes that the researchers are looking at are movement patterns. So whether or not they fawn or it is not super relevant to the core question. So that is an issue that might come up. In terms of whether or not it's a good fit for your community, or if your community is a good fit for what the research needs are. And then, who carries out these types of projects? Management is carried out by, wildlife managers, contractors, or other trained personnel, and that group of people is going to continue to grow, especially as these tools become more available. But for research, it's carried out specifically by your research team, and it's usually, principal investigators, scientific personnel, academics, and their job is to really adhere to the design of the study and carry out the tasks of that study. The permit process is pretty similar. You still have to go through your agencies to receive permits, whether it's management or research. And then one thing that, Tony did a really great job of driving home is access to animals. So it doesn't really matter what your method is. If you cannot physically access your target, you're right there, you're kind of at a non-starter. So things that really play a role in access outside of landscapes topography, which was much better presented with pictures. Deer behavior, bait leverage, will it be required? What other things are growing and delicious for deer? Will you even get bait leverage if you start putting other things out? Those are things you have to consider in terms of accessibility, behavior. And you also have to kind of consider the animal that you're working with. So trying to design a project where you're gonna maybe drive around in the afternoon to get as many deer as you can, you're not really adhering to the deer's normal behavior. So working that into your field planning is super important. Political landscapes, private property support, the private property access issue is huge, especially for urban deer issues. I know several folks have already spoken about it, but we can dart in Hastings, for example, we can dart a deer at a flagged property, and it can run, 3 or 4 properties over on a property that is unflagged or unknown. And sometimes, people don't want to on a property, and, they'll say, hey, no thanks, but you're still obligated to now go collect that animal because it's sedated and you can't leave it there. So the more access to kind of an amenable agreement between property owners just to allow field staff on their property for a short period of time, that will get you a little bit more of efficiency, because you really do need to be able to do your job. Once you plan it all out, it will all look great, but if you can't get into those, those safe areas where you as a field person know that you can effectively, and safely dart an animal, and you have an idea of where it might go, that all you have to play that out. So if you don't have landscapes or properties that are amenable to that decision-making process, it's really gonna hamstring your ability to be efficient in the field. So implementing a project. So these are just some considerations for folks that get beyond the I want to do a project phase, but here's some considerations to really mapping it out. These are some deer in Hastings. So how will the animals receive treatment, and specifically for immunocontraception, but a lot of this is relevant for surgical sterilization as well. Capture versus remote darting. So as you can see just by looking here, if capture is a part of your project protocol, you've got a whole lot of things to worry about and consider versus if you're just remote darting. Some of those are costs is a huge deal, but also what the requirements are for your field team. The skill set for using chemical capture versus just darting with a vaccine can be pretty different, and if you don't have personnel that are experienced and comfortable with anesthetics and how anesthetics work in deer, it's going to be a bumpy road. So those things are pretty much a requirement. Veterinary oversight for that type of thing, also a requirement. It does increase the cost of treatment per deer, because in order to handle deer safely, they have to be sedated. And that comes at a bunch of money. So there is also increased logistical efforts and time spent on each animal. So if you're remote darting with just PZP, it's a matter of pulling up, identifying who's who, finding your mark, ensuring that there's a plausible and safe darting opportunity, and then taking your shot, getting out, collecting your dart. And it's relatively easy sounding. When you're dealing with chemical capture, you've got to have that same scenario present, roll up, make sure it's a safe environment, identify the animal, dart them, and then wait for about 10 to 15 minutes, turn on your tracker, and then spend about anywhere from 5 minutes to an hour finding that animal, then doing your workup, ear tagging, getting the necessary samples that you might need depending on your design, and then reversing that animal. So you're committed to the animal for a much longer period of time when you're utilizing chemical capture than you are with just vaccine darting itself. Safety protocols, obviously when you're using anesthetics, those spike up pretty high because your danger element also increases with that. And then again, with the access, you need even more access to animals in private properties because you have no idea where they're gonna go. And you, like I said before, you're obligated once you have sedated that animal to find it and work it up and make sure that your effort, it was worth it. And so otherwise, what are you doing? So these are just a couple of picture examples of some of the chemical capture processes. And as you can tell, it's not just one person is able to go out and pan and do this. You have to have a team of people. So that's another thing to consider as well. And they fall wherever they want, whether it be in the snow, halfway up a hill, or in the middle of a cul-de-sac. These are all kind of real life scenarios that, as plenty of people have described, really do happen. And cost considerations, I think Lori drove home a very important part. It's easy to get caught up on, the cost per deer when you think about your total budget. Then the next couple of slides that I'll present on are basically cost per deer just based on the treatment plan itself and the labor cost. So not really looking at much of the other details and the costs spent elsewhere. But there's cost variability, and it's based on your method, for one, whether or not you need to capture. There's a huge price difference, and we'll see that. And then again, access to animals and safe darting opportunities. Okay, so our first one here is Fire Island, and this is just kind of a breakdown of the cost per deer based on, like I said, the cost of the treatment plus hours spent in the field. And so this is kind of broken down. Labor of cost per deer is $15 per hour, and that is the same ranking that you'll see through all of these slides. Dr. Ruppberg is the author of these slides. So for Fire Island, you see that your initial treatment cost and your booster treatment costs are exactly the same because they did not have to capture and tag deer. So their costs in terms of the treatment and the man hours were pretty much even for both initial and booster doses. Our next consideration is from NIST, which is in Gaithersburg. Initial treatment costs in year one include the need to capture. And then, labor hours per deer. Like I said before, when you're using anesthetics, you're committed to that deer for a much longer period of time. So that factors into the average number of hours per animal. Booster treatments are significantly lower because boosters do not require sedation. So then you're kind of back down to just labor hours and cost of the treatment itself. And then another example here is Fripp Island, South Carolina, where you've got the initial treatment cost using PZP 22, which we all remember is the time-released version of the vaccine. So it comes at an additional cost. So you've got your treatment with PZP 22 plus your capture. So cost per deer is going to be higher than that of just a remote delivered vaccine. But in subsequent years, when it was just about remote delivered vaccines, you can see that the cost is much lower than that. So your upfront costs, if you have to capture animals for identification purposes or whatever other research parameter you might be looking at, those are going to be the most expensive, and they do taper off when you no longer have to handle the animal in the same fashion. Additional costs that weren't included in that you do have to consider when you're designing or implementing a plan are field personnel salaries. What those are, what those look like, and who you're using. That's a huge variable, and whether or not you're using local help or if you're having folks come to you to participate, you'd have to set up lodging, travel, all of that stuff. Since we do most of our work out of a field vehicle, you have to consider there's some fees in that as well. So making sure that you have monies set aside for covering some of these incidentals that might not necessarily be part of the deer capture itself and the treatment itself is one of those important things to consider when you start crunching your numbers. All right. So for field protocols and procedures, I'm not giving you examples of this is how you do it, this is what you do, but you really need to make sure that they fit the criteria. Safety first is going to be hands down the most important thing. Safety for your team, safety for your animals, safety for non-target animals. When you're doing chemical capture, like we kind of demonstrated in the pictures earlier, you're never alone because that never ends well. So you want to make sure that you have enough personnel so that you can actually safely carry the work out. And then, you have to have very clearly identified protocols that either the public or your private property owners know about that identifies who's going to be doing the work, where it's going to be done, when. And the more transparent you are with all of that information, it's been my experience that you get much less pushback because you're managing people's expectations ahead of time, and the shock value is tapered down quite a bit. And then, considering chemical capture and animal handling, if that's part of your project design, that comes with an entire slew of additional considerations that you need to plan for. Veterinary oversight and sound veterinary anesthetic record keeping is required at all times. So you've got to have people that have experience with that and are keeping very, very good notes and making sure things stay organized and lawful. So your anesthetic protocols are going to be specific to what you're doing with animals. So we heard from Dr. Newman earlier, tilazol is xylazine used for surgical intervention, but there might be other anesthetics that you use for just mild sedation to work on an animal, reverse them then and there that work in a different fashion, but still sedate them to the level at what you need, and all of those are really going to be guided by your veterinarian or your very experienced chemical immobilizer. And then, of course, you always want to share your protocols with municipal offices, police department, EMS. If you're going to be doing anything with chemical capture, that's really important that your EMS or your local dispatch office knows what you're using so that they can be prepared if something should happen. They know, the potential hazards and what to do, what medications to use or maybe not use in the state of a crazy emergency. That has never happened, but always plan for the worst, right? PZP darting requirements, as it stands now, and these are still going to be mapped out here as we move forward with state registration, but PZP certification course is offered at our manufacturer of native PZP at the Science and Conservation Center in Billings, Montana. And that's typically a 2 to 3 day course that teaches you how to handle, mix, prepare the vaccine, as well as gives you a pretty involved overview of how it works and the history. Plus, you get some hands-on darting experience at some target practice. Which, once you start with that, you can't just go to a class, dart a couple targets, and feel like, yep, I'm going to go dart some live animals. It takes a significant amount of practice, and sometimes that means additional classes and frequent practice. So even though, you might be working in the field a couple months out of the year, you really do need to make sure that either yourselves or whoever your darters are, that they're also taking the time to maintain their skill set throughout the rest of the year when things are quiet. But yeah, don't think that you take one class and you can go dart everything, because it's not going to be as easy as you think. Not to scare anyone, you can do it, but it does take dedication and patience, and as with anything, you have to practice. Regulatory considerations by state, again, those are going to be state specific, and whether or not you need a particular license to hold to apply that to deer, that's all still going to be in the works. So unfortunately, I have no answers on that for you. So if that's your question, sorry. And then chemical capture and darting, of course, requires additional coursework, training. If you have veterinary medical experience, that's always a huge plus. Comfortability with anesthetics going into something like that is really, really helpful. Or contracting folks that have existing experience and knowledge will get you pretty far. Now we get into kind of the pretty basic stuff that a lot of you probably have either handled yourselves or had some exposure to, but for those that haven't, here we go. So Zonostat D and PZP, I'm not going to talk about how they are different, or PZP 22, sorry, about how they are different, but just kind of what you do in terms of your dart. So Zonostat, you're taking your two vaccine components and mixing it in an emulsion. So down here is, you can see it's kind of a thick white paste is basically how that emulsion appears once it's readily mixed. And then you simply are able to load it right into the dart, or if you're giving a hand injection, you transfer it to the syringe that you're going to be doing that with, and it's relatively easy and can be done in about a minute in the field. And then PZP 22, there's an extra step there. So the pellets themselves have to be loaded into that same dart or via a different syringe, and you put your emulsion in first, and then you'd slide your pellets into the needle. So when your dart reaches its target, you've got the PZP pellets pushed in by the force of the vaccine, which is also pushed in. So that's how they get their full treatment there. If you're doing hand injections, we typically will give the injection of PZP itself, and then in the same area or pretty proximal to that same muscle group, give the time release pellets in that area as well, excuse me. And the pellets are pretty small. Like Alan had said before, they're made out of essentially like absorbable suture material, but they're tiny little grains of rice. So drinking a lot of coffee and then trying to do it is really not helpful. But getting your fine motor skills in there is pretty much required for PZP 22. And then some of the darts and delivery systems we use, and I brought a bunch of samples so people can kind of get a feel for what they look like. And essentially we, depending on the type of treatment you're giving, telemetry darts we use when we're using anesthetics so that we can track that animal and do the full process and recovery. Those are longer and have a couple of different components. One is your medication is in one section, and then your transmitter is on another section of the dart. And those are a little bit longer, so you do have to adjust your darting scenario a little bit and be mindful about how fast that longer, heavier thing is going to hit the animal. The PZP darts themselves are little 1 cc darts that are really light, so you have a little bit more room to be farther away from the animal if you needed to be without causing a ton of trauma to the musculature or anything like that. The vaccines are self-injecting, or the darts, are self-injecting. So once they hit the target, essentially they have a mechanism inside them that pushes the plunger forward and really gets that medication into the target itself. And we deliver these either by hand injection with a normal needle and syringe, or if you're using a dart projector, which I've brought a few, rifles, pistols. Some people use blowpipes. You have to be pretty close for that or really, really good at it. And I don't have the lung capacity for that, so I stick to tools. Some of the dart projectors can look really daunting, like the one up here. you know, if you didn't know, it looks insane, and people walking by that would say, oh my gosh, what are you about to do? So really doing a lot of education up front when you know what tools you're going to use, help mitigate any potential scares with letting people see what it is you're using. And then some of the things that are currently being explored in terms of delivery systems, that fixed collaring and treatment setup, that's still on a list that's being tweaked here and there. Drone darting is also a newer one. There's a lot of folks that are looking at this in the horse community. So those are things that we're paying attention to and figuring out whether or not they're logistically feasible to use in deer. Animal identification and tracking methods. We currently, for a lot of these programs, when we need to sedate animals, you have to identify them, right? So animals need to have a readily available sign that says, hey, I've received medication. If for some reason it's taken, a hunter would know, A, not to eat it, and B, to report that they've taken an animal. But it also helps the community gauge, who's been treated and who hasn't. So when they say, wow, there are so many deer, oftentimes what I've found, especially here in Hastings, is people see the same deer repeatedly throughout the day. So without the tags, they think, holy cow, there's, I saw 6 deer in 2 hours, but it could be the same 1 or 2 animals just kind of hanging out in the same zone. So it is really helpful at allowing people to better measure kind of their number of animals. It's also helpful for the field team to know who's who when you're trying to retreat animals that are due. And for research, it's super significant because we need to know each individual animal based on what their treatment protocol would look like. For management purposes, right now, there's no parameter on whether or not you're going to need to tag deer if you don't have to sedate them. So like in Fire Island, they didn't have to capture animals, therefore you don't have ear tags, therefore this step can be cut out pretty much completely. In terms of some of the newer tech that we're exploring here in the upcoming months, this is actually a picture of a GPS ear tag, so to take a step away from the collars to see if there's a different approach for some folks that might not be interested in using collars for whatever reasons. This was kind of one of those testable alternatives just to see if it would work. It is still very much in the design phases. I only had 2 tags, and unfortunately neither did what I wanted them to do. So back to the drawing board there, but companies are working on this, and they're really connecting with the research community to make these things really user-friendly and accountable for collecting data that might otherwise be missed. We've got some folks working on visual recognition software for deer, which will be really cool and have a high amount of function, especially for folks that won't be tagging their animals. And then RFID or microchips we've talked about a couple of times today. We're working on trying to utilize those in the field to see what types of identification results we can come up with that for free roaming deer. Additional helpful fieldwork tools when you start accruing your items. Field cameras are pretty much a must to help you really stay organized and plan to be in certain areas at certain times. But also they help to, coordinate with folks that are doing some of your population estimates. That's one of the really less monetary costly ways of capturing that data. But then you've got to have somebody go through all of those pictures, and there are hundreds of thousands. Bait stations, if your project includes bait, here's a couple pictures of some automatic feeders, so you can put some fixed stations out that will put corn out. It is recommended you put some signage on, or you might end up like Mayor Swiderski and get some corn in the face. So, so know your tools and know your equipment, and make sure that that your community has a pretty good understanding of the capabilities there. And then, other things to consider in the field. If you're darting from vehicles, you need to have access to appropriate darting areas in the vehicles, or you can certainly try setting up blinds and things like that. It really is going to depend on your particular location, your animals, and the scope of what you're trying to accomplish. Questions?